Greetings, Resident Evil fanatics. It's getting dark out here. I hope you don't mind that certain someone walking beside us. It appears they have something for us today, something long forgotten. Let's take a look. Ah, yes. Here lies a written account of a deceased architect, George Trevor. And it seems there's not one, not two, but 3 different accounts here, and I'm willing to bet that you've only ever seen this one, Trevor's Diary of the 2002 GameCube remake. It remains the popular recollection of his descent into despair, scattered among various rooms of his final resting place. This, along with the accounts of his wife and daughter, describe the ghastly fate that befell the Trevors, at least, the way most of us remember it. But what is the second version of the story? And the third? The second was never meant to be read or even seen. Though the original Resident Evil had no such Trevor's Diary, the demo disc did contain something that resembled it. But this file wasn't directly accessible in-game and needed to be extracted from the disc itself. A copy of it currently sits in the Project Umbrella site called Trevor's Notes, and by rewriting this early prototype, the current version and remake, Trevor's Diary, was written. And it was again rewritten into a third version of the file. In a previous analysis, we explored Chris's untold story in Resident Evil, the book. Also known as Biohazard, the Beginning, this is a part of the exclusive Sega Saturn bonus package called The True Story Behind Biohazard. And in this same bonus package lies the third version of George Trevor's story. The 2 alternate versions offer a detailed record of his unfortunate undertaking, with some exclusive events that occur prior to his entrapment, and the records of such happenings are etched with clever contextual details which explain otherwise arbitrary items in the mansion. For starters, why does Lord Spencer keep a broken shotgun in his firearms room? Or rather, how exactly did the shotgun break? And how did the musical score end up in the small dining room? Answers await you in these relics of the past. Lots to discuss tonight. I can only hope that our guest doesn't get too excited. Let us begin. Brace yourself, as this one's going to get sinister. By comparing the 3 accounts to each other, we can see that all of them sync up at this point in the story. In all versions, this passage sounds something like, "It's been this many days now, and I'm trapped," followed by George's brief encounter with a nondescript man in a lab coat. This is actually how Trevor's Diary begins in Remake. It reads, 11 days have passed since arriving on this estate. How did I end up like this? A guy in a lab coat came with a plate of skimpy meal and said to me, "Sorry to put you through this, but it's for security reasons." In the scrapped second version of the story, this passage is the 6th of his 9 entries, and in the third version from the true story behind Biohazard, this passage is appropriately titled Confinement. From this point onwards, the 3 files have a fairly similar progression towards his final moments. In all versions, he loses his wife Jessica's lighter, the same lighter that Jill finds and uses in her scenario. George then gradually loses his way about the mansion, spiraling into despair. He eventually stumbles upon his own gravestone and draws his last breath. While all versions end as such, the 2 alternate versions provide a much more comprehensive imagining of George's story, exploring why he actually revisits the mansion to begin with. So let's return to this point where all 3 files converge, which again is the starting point in Trevor's Diary. Here in the released version, he never explains why he's returned to the Spencer estate after its construction, just that 11 days have passed since being there. The preceding events that explain his visit were cut completely from Trevor's Diary of Remake and are only discoverable through these 2 alternate files. Trevor's prequel story starts with an invitation. The version in the true story behind Biohazard gives us a preliminary statement with this header: "A man returned to the mansion." That's how it all started. The statement reads, "Raccoon City, a town in the Midwestern United States of America. A magnificent mansion was nestled in a dense forest on the outskirts. On November 13, 1967, a man stood in front of its doors. George Trevor, a well-known architect living in New York, who designed and built this mansion. His client, the wealthy Oswald E. Spencer, invited him and his family to the mansion as a thank you for completing its construction. Trevor sent his wife Jessica and their 14-year-old daughter Lisa ahead of him, finished his work, then followed. However, when Trevor arrived at the mansion, his wife and daughter were no longer there. And Trevor, who entered the mansion, never came out again. Where did he and his family disappear to? And from this point onwards, the entirety of this version is told from George's perspective. On the other hand, the scrapped version, Trevor's Notes, is written from multiple perspectives, starting from Spencer's. Here, Spencer's invitation reads, "To my friend, George Trevor, you have painstakingly constructed a glorious mansion. It has already been 3 months since I moved to this house. This location is marvelous. Morning dawns with the hustle and bustle of hunters, and the fall of night is accompanied by the howls of wolves. But there is still something missing here, so I would like to ask you to do me a favor. Would you be willing to pay a visit to the mansion? Bring your family with you, of course. We will meet as old friends. You may feel free to come along. I will have arranged a most festive banquet awaiting your arrival. October 9th, 1967. With reverence to you, Oswald E. Spencer." To which George responds, "Dear Lord Oswald E. Spencer, I cannot thank you enough for inviting my family to the new mansion. The desire to see that mansion again has been on my mind. I wish to accept your invitation. The lush, gorgeous garden, brimming with water, and the beautiful fountain with 2 names. To get to the fountain, I must remind you to never forget to bring that red book and the blue book. However, I still have some unfinished business to attend to. I wish to send my family there first. As such, I would like to request that you please take good care of them. November 3rd, 1967. With my gratitude, George Trevor." Just from these introductions alone, both alternate versions have added a layer of cohesion to George's story. After 5 arduous years of constructing the grand estate, Spencer invited the Trevors to a lavish banquet. And the story doesn't end there. It only starts, painting a picture that we didn't know existed. And note the red book and blue book in this file, sometimes called Doom Book 1 and Doom Book 2 in the original RE1. Here, George claims that the books are needed to reach the fountain itself, while their medallions are actually used to drain the fountain and descend into the laboratory. This item reference was probably included as a hint to the player, and may also suggest that the books had a slightly different use than their current one. Interesting. We'll see several more meaningful item references later on. It's also crucial to note that George is the one who willingly sent his wife and daughter first, obliging Spencer by feeding directly into his plans. Yearning to reunite with his beloved creation, and tempted by the luscious food and drink that awaited him, George set off for the Spencer mansion, arriving just after 6 p.m. one day after work. Jessica and Lisa should be just inside, he must have thought. A vast, opulent room of splendid proportions lay in front of George's eyes, the vaulted ceiling greeting him with open arms. His heart swelled and his mouth watered over the succulent dishes that adorned the mahogany table in front of him. Food and drink so irresistible, in fact, that even Rodin's goddess statue peered down longingly from the floor above, pleading for a morsel. And in the scrapped second version, George does give her something out of pity. In both alternate versions, this goddess statue is overtly described as envious of the 2 men and the delicious meal that lay below, as if she would move heaven and earth for just one bite of that feast. Bearing this in mind, it's fascinating that her ultimate end, should the player oblige her, is to be pushed down to the first floor, landing her next to the dining table as she so desires. But even with Lord Spencer at the table, and with the goddess eyeing them from above, a sudden emptiness enveloped George. The ticking clock was all he could hear. It was terribly lonely indeed. Lisa and Jessica were nowhere to be found. So where were they? In the scrapped version of the demo disc, Jessica's letter is provided in full, and she states that herself and Lisa had left to visit Aunt Emma, who had fallen ill. But in the third version, from the true story behind Biohazard, Spencer simply informs George of their visit to the ill auntie at the dining table. But of course, Aunt Emma's sickness was a farce, a ploy fabricated by Spencer to placate George, hiding any hint of his horrid plans. But even knowing this, it's interesting to see Jessica's letter written out in full in the scrapped version. Perhaps her abductees forced her to write this letter to George, which would add credibility to Spencer's ploy. On the other hand, perhaps Jessica's letter was intended to be at least partially real, implying that Jessica and Lisa truly did enjoy the mansion to the fullest before being captured. And supporting this possibility is one last nugget of interest in this feast passage in both alternate versions. Lisa allegedly played Moonlight Sonata on Spencer's piano. In the scrapped version, this is included in Jessica's letter, also adding that, "Our girl has misplaced her favorite music sheet. I wonder where she has left it." Supposedly, this was added to suggest that Lisa misplaced the sheets for Moonlight Sonata in the small dining room, the room that holds the score, in the official release of RE1. But again, as far as we know, Lisa and Jessica never savored their time at the mansion, for they were immediately abducted and experimented on. And so, Lisa wouldn't have been able to lose her favorite sheet of music, let alone play the piece at all. But to further entertain this scenario, the remake splits up the musical score into two distinct items, one containing the beginning and end, and the other containing the sheets in the middle, again entertaining the possibility that Lisa played this captivating melody, a tune so beautiful that even Lord Spencer praised her before losing the sheets in the middle. And in the true story behind Biohazard, George buys this story happily, thinking, "I can see it in my mind's eye," both smiling in pride. Much like Resident Evil, the book, George Trevor's prequel story is etched with numerous clever tie-ins like these, which add substance to the mansion's iconic items, whether these happenings are canon or not. The ambiguous, inconclusive nature of these happenings reflect the broken memories of George, and also the deteriorating psyches of his wife and daughter, almost as if no one, not even Capcom, can tell us exactly, without question, what happened here. After all, every story does well to maintain some of its mystery, its suspicion. Lord Spencer accompanies George as they tour through the grandiose estate. George notes the room with taxidermied beasts and the suspicious light in their eyes, as well as the room lined with medieval knights, followed by a series of Da Vinci paintings and Raphael sculptures. I'm glad these alternate files touched on the visual extravagance of the estate, as this is a critical element of the Resident Evil formula. Previously in the Beneviento Film Inspirations analysis, I mentioned how Resident Evil continually draws from Giallo horror elements, one of which is a raincoat and fedora-clad killer, which RE2 implements with Mr. X, and another of which is the common Giallo exploitation of showy, pretentious art. Ostentatious art and sculptures, especially used arbitrarily, are an essential part of the equation, and would fittingly return in RE2, as the RPD was originally an art museum. This conveniently allowed the artsy-fartsy aesthetic of Greco-Roman busts, sculptures, and paintings to continue. These, along with knight's armor, lavish dining tables, and other Giallo art tropes, would again adorn the later titles, just as they do the earlier ones. And it all started here, in Trevor's design of the first mansion. In the true story behind Biohazard, Spencer then mutters slyly about his plans, describing the mansion as a recreation center for the employees, which sparks George's suspicion, considering all the secret mechanisms they implemented. But in the scrapped version from the demo disc, Spencer describes the recreational center as a separate building, which presumably became the residence in the final game. From here on out, George's worries grow worse and worse, especially after his encounters with the researchers. This is another slight discrepancy between the two alternate versions. In the scrapped version, George overhears a discussion in Spencer's study room, which sounds something like, "Huge market, highly commodifiable, basic research stage, since still simple life, take a long time." He leans in too heavily to the door, and a man with red hair looks towards George, startled, but then tries to pretend as if nothing was wrong. The true story behind Biohazard features a similar encounter, this time with George approaching the area behind the waterfall. Noticing that this wasn't his design, 3 men nudge him away, smelling of disinfectant. Nothing out of the ordinary so far, but keep the red-headed man in mind, as he's important. The next passage in both versions describes George losing his wife's lighter, which is nothing new considering that this happens in Trevor's diary of Remake. In the true story behind Biohazard, an anxious George then decides to leave the next morning. He packs his bags and heads to the room with the cradle-to-grave portraits to bid Spencer farewell, but another man finds him instead and utters the words, "Life is long and short. By now, your family is..." The man grinned maliciously, and George is knocked out. He is then dragged into confinement, and thus the story continues as written in the version we know, Trevor's diary, until he perishes at his own gravestone. This essentially marks the end of his unique scenario from the true story behind Biohazard. But the scrapped version offers another fascinating nugget before it arrives at this point. In this version, he doesn't plan to leave the estate, but he does enter the room of portraits. In that same room, the red-headed man returns and asks him, "I have a question for you. Do you know anything on your family?" George responds angrily, "My family? Do you know something about them?" He shakes the man and demands answers, but gets nothing. The next morning, George finds his servants meticulously wiping the floor in an empty room, trying to erase the dark stains and red hair from his sight. As George peered into the next room, he noticed that the hunting rifle was missing. It was previously hanging from a mount on the wall, but it was no longer. He asked, "What happened to the hunting rifle that was here?" To which Spencer casually replied, "Oh, that thing. It was broken, like it had been stepped on by an elephant. At least it retains its original form, unlike the animal. I still have a spare left." The bloodstains and red hair littered the floor in the room just adjacent to it. Very interesting. So, the red-headed man must have realized the danger of his situation and tried to escape. He must have grabbed the hunting rifle from the wall and been pulverized by the ceiling trap, leaving only his blood, his red hair, and a broken, smashed hunting rifle behind. Excellent. While it isn't quite a shotgun, or maybe it was meant to be, but translated more vaguely, this certainly sheds light on why a broken shotgun exists in the mansion. And after this little incident, George then lands himself in confinement, which then syncs up with the other 2 files, effectively concluding the exclusive happenings of George Trevor's story. What a journey this was. This was the dawn of something truly revolutionary. These are the genre-defining survival horror game files that would inevitably re-emerge in nearly every survival horror title that followed, even to this day. It's files like The Keeper's Diary and every version of Trevor's notes that spark a sense of wonder in the players, imploring them to investigate the madness before them and compelling them to ask questions. Which version of Trevor's story is your favorite? Do you think these scrap files should have been included in the original Resident Evil? Let us know what you think in the comments, and let us know what type of lore content you'd like to see in the future. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this in-depth analysis video, feel free to check out my personal channel. The link is in the description. Be sure to check out our Untold Story of Chris analysis, as it is also part of the true story behind Biohazard. More Resident Evil content will be coming to the Residents of Evil sometime soon. Until then, subscribe, or Lisa will saunter after you. Her wail's just outside your window.